Hello and welcome. My name is Mark Agers. I'm the director of the Institute for Child Development and Family Relations. We support families, parents, and children in the Inland Empire region through research, education, and programs in the community. I welcome each of you to today's webinar, Talking to Your Children About Death and Loss. Following today's presentation will be a question and answer session with the speakers. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Amanda Wilcox and Teresa Olin. Dr. Wilcox is a faculty member at California State University, San Bernardino, where she teaches child development classes. She has experience teaching young children in early development and elementary school and supervises the Infant Toddler Lab School on the CSUSB campus. Dr. Wilcox is passionate about helping young children and their caregivers to talk openly about difficult issues. Teresa Olin holds a master's degree in child development, which she earned from CSUSB. Teresa currently works as an early childhood education trainer in Los Angeles County and previously was an infant and toddler teacher at California State University, San Bernardino. With that, please give a warm welcome to today's speakers, Amanda and Teresa.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and start, and then Teresa is going to take it from there. So we wanted to start out just by thinking a little bit about why we avoid talking about death with young children. I think for the most part, we have the sense that children are too little to talk about this, that death is kind of a morbid, scary topic, that children don't think about it themselves. So why should you talk about something that children aren't thinking about anyway? That it's our job as adults, right, to protect young children and to keep them safe from this difficult topic, that they can't cope appropriately, that they don't have the mechanisms and the tools that they need to be able to navigate such a difficult topic. And a lot of it is that we're afraid that we might say something wrong, right? We're uncomfortable with this topic. We're uncomfortable about death. And so topics that we're uncomfortable with, we tend to want to avoid. So we know, though, next slide, please, that death is all around us. Children see it, they hear it, they experience it. You can see from this slide that up to 2/3 of children experience death before the age of 10. It is everywhere. It's in the media, in movies, in the news, in television shows. I can remember myself as a small child, and this is going to date me a little, but crying hysterically over things like Bambi and Old Yeller. So it's definitely something that children are aware of and they're thinking about. And yes, it is a sensitive, difficult topic, but just like any other kind of trauma, that's when children need us the most, right? So we know from trauma-informed care that young children benefit from that safety net, right? That scaffolding that helps them to navigate difficult experiences, that they cannot build the coping skills that they will need unless there is an adult there to help with that skill building. So it's very, very important for us to talk with young children about this topic, and it is absolutely impossible to shield them from it. It's a natural part of life, from the lizard in the picture to, unfortunately, a grandparent or sometimes even somebody closer, a sibling or a parent. So definitely a very important topic. Next, please. So I did want to provide a little bit of developmental context before Teresa starts talking about tips, things that we can do to help support children in this area. So children's understanding of death depends on 3 skills. So 1, it depends on their cognitive skills, it depends on their knowledge of biology, and then it depends on their emotional skills. And we'll get into each one of these on the next slide. So in terms of cognitive skills, and I do want to say that this particular talk, Teresa and I are focusing on younger children. So we're focusing on infants and toddlers and preschoolers. That does not mean that you should not discuss death with children who are older than that. But we're trying to focus in this talk on children who really don't have a good full understanding of what death means. So there are some developmental differences that are important to pay attention to, and there are different ways that you would approach this topic with very young children versus children who are older. But I did want to also point out that when we get to the question and answer period, that Teresa and I are very happy to answer questions about little kids that we're focusing on for this talk, as well as big kids. So don't hesitate to ask us about any age group. We are ready for you. So in terms of cognitive skills, we know from developmental research with relationship to cognition that cause and effect relationships are very difficult for young children. They really have kind of a tenuous grasp on when something happens, why it happened, what the outcomes of that event are going to be. There's definitely a lot of cause and effect understanding that needs to play into understanding death. You'll see I'm going to kind of jump down to the middle one of understanding biology. I've happened upon this wonderful body of literature about children being naive biologists and what they understand about biology in general, about birth and life and death. And they can distinguish between living and non-living things. And they know that there are things inside you that make you work, right? So they're not quite sure what's in there, but they know there are things in there that help you to breathe and eat and go to the bathroom and all those wonderful things that they are so focused on. But despite that, young children do tend to display something called animism. So oftentimes they will think that non-living things can exhibit living qualities. So the rock moved, the sun is following me. Even though they know that things are alive and not alive, their understanding of exactly what that means is a little new still. They tend to think very concretely. So for them, death is kind of complex, right? Because sometimes death isn't very concrete. You can't see exactly why a person died. You can't see exactly what happened inside their body that made them stop working and made them stop living. And so there's these very abstract, non-tangible qualities of death that make it difficult for very young children. They also have a very hard time with reversibility. So they have a hard time understanding that not everything can go backwards, right? So with death, it is final. There is not a way to reverse it. You're not sleeping and you're going to wake up. So that understanding of this is an event that has happened that can't be reversed is also going to be something that's difficult. So with regard to emotional skills, children, definitely young children respond to the emotions of others. They pick up on the tone of the room. So, back to that idea that they're not paying attention and they're not thinking about death and this isn't something that affects them. If it affects you, I promise it absolutely affects them. And death affects us, right? And scary, sad situations affect us. So they will definitely be picking up on that and feeling that. And they need our help. Regulating emotions is not something that young children are very capable of doing by themselves. So they need us to be that emotional regulator and give those skills to them. We have a little bit to work with here because children do recognize distress. They want to comfort others. You might see them patting somebody's back or reaching out and handing a toy to someone. So these are feelings and emotions they are very well aware of, and their desire is to help if they can. So this is a kind of complicated chart, and I would encourage you, Teresa and I are very proud. We took her master's thesis and we spent quite a long time cutting it down and down and down, and finally got it to a point where it got to publication form. So you can see the link in yellow down there. That is a link to an article about this that Teresa and I just published, and we're quite pleased with ourselves. So this is actually a chart from that article that I would encourage you to take a further look at. But there is a wide body of literature about what it takes for young children to have a full understanding of death. These are called death concepts. So you can see that death is inevitable. It's universal. So everybody dies. It happens to all living things. That it cannot be reversed, that it is final, that it includes the cessation of body function, that your body stops working, it doesn't do what it needs to do anymore, and that it's caused by something. Maybe that's old age, an illness, an accident. And so you can see that there's kind of stages to acquiring these death concepts. So we're talking about the middle of this chart. We're talking about younger children who don't fully have these death concepts yet. So you can see that they might think that not everybody dies, or that you can wake up, right? That you can come back from the dead, that you might still be able to do things, right? Because we know when we're sleeping, we're still thinking. So maybe you could still do that when you're dead. And that it tends to be related to external things. So it's very hard for them, again, to understand those less tangible reasons that people might die. Once children get to be older, once they get past about 7 or 8 or so, then they start to have a more full understanding of these death concepts and think about death more like adults would. So we also just wanted to, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but we did want to give you some ideas about what an understanding of death might look like for children in general, and then what it might look like in terms of these age specific, so infants and toddlers and preschoolers. So in terms of children's general reactions to death, this is something that would cut across ages potentially. So, if you have a child at home and they have experienced loss of somebody close to them, these are things that you might expect. If you have a child in your classroom who you know that someone close to them recently died, these are things that you need to be on the lookout for. If you are working specifically with infants and toddlers or with preschoolers, these are some age-specific things that you might see. But this is helpful. This is helpful for us, right, to think about developmentally. It's always important for us to remember that children's behaviors are a window into what they're thinking and feeling. So children do not exhibit behavior in a vacuum, right? So they're not just doing something to irritate you or just to do it. They're exhibiting a behavior because they're trying to tell you something. And so we need to pay attention to these behaviors that we might see because they are a window into what children are thinking, feeling, and experiencing that we can work with. And that's what Teresa is going to talk about next. So I'm just going to give a quick preview. Teresa is going to talk about all these wonderful things in a very short amount of time. So again, I would encourage you to take a look at that paper. It'll give you more detail. But she's going to give you some really great tips and tools related to each one of these items on the next upcoming slides. So without further ado, here's Teresa.
Thank you. Like Amanda said, it's going to be quick, so bear with me. But each of those points from the previous slide are going to be discussed here. And like she said, they're in our paper, even further detail. So go ahead and check it out if you can. First and foremost, really thinking about providing honest and accurate explanations of what that death is. So really using the words of dead and died. That's the number one starting point, is actually using those words. Because like Amanda was saying, there is a lot of confusion as to whether or not it can be reversed, if it's temporary, because it's not temporary, it means forever. So if you use a word or euphemism like sleeping, or they went away, or they're on vacation, anything like that, that can be very confusing to a child. And then they have to unlearn it. So we're really trying to use those words dead and died first and foremost, just to get that understanding that this is what we're talking about. Because in the picture on the right, the doctor is telling the family, we lost him. He just got away from us, and I'm sorry. And then the voiceover is saying lost in the sense that George Sr. escaped the hospital and he can't find them. So words like lost, well, let's go find them. If they went away, let's go there too. If they're on vacation, Grandpa went on vacation. Okay, well, we go on vacation all the time. Are we going to come back? So really thinking about avoiding those words and using the words dead and died, because that's what they need to hear. With that, then you can further explain what that means to be dead or die, which is what's on this next slide. So, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means. This is just a very few examples of what maybe you've heard in the past and kind of how to rephrase it to a way that a child can understand. So instead of saying your pet fish is sleeping, or maybe just, and we've done it, families have done it for years, they just replace it with another fish and like nothing happened. Instead, try saying your fish is dead now. It can no longer eat its food. It can't breathe. It can't swim. It can't poop. It can't do anything like that. Those are all concrete things that a child can see the fish doing. It moves its gills. It's alive. Whereas now it is dead. And this is what it means to be dead to a fish. If you say your sister is sleeping, instead say your sister died today. It might be that you had a miscarriage or maybe a stillbirth or something like that. But either way, no matter what kind of death it is, use the word they died. They died today. Because that's still a loss to the child and they're still going to try to process that with you. If you use something like they died of cardiac arrest and CPR didn't work, those are really big terms that even some adults don't fully understand how it works. So again, if it's not something that you understand and believe, try not to say it yourself. Instead, you can say that her heart stopped beating and she died. It's very concrete. You can hear your heartbeat. You can see your lungs go in and out. That's very concrete learning of what it means to be alive. So when somebody dies, that means you don't see their chest going up and down. You can't feel their belly breathing, anything like that. If you're saying, lastly, if your family pet is gone now, well, the child's not going to go find it, but instead just say that the dog was very, very old and they died, or they were very, very sick and they died. If you say it was grandma's time to go, instead try saying grandma's very, very, very sick and old. Because again, to a child, if you ask them how old you are, they'll say you're 100, even though you might not be 100. You might only be in your 30s or 40s. But to them, you can be very old. So emphasizing that very, very old or that very, very sick, and letting them know that the doctor did try to help them, but they couldn't get better and they died. So you don't want to have them think that anytime they go to the hospital that they're going to die, but rather the doctors were trying, that they did do what they could, but unfortunately they did die. There are instances like school shootings where sometimes people just don't talk about it because they don't want to scare the children. Instead, try saying a very bad person used their gun to shoot people. Some of the people who were shot were hurt very, very badly and they died. So again, it's not hushing up about the shooting. It's opening up that conversation because, like Amanda said, they pick up on any of your emotions. If you're stressed, they pick up on the stress. If you're hugging them really tight before school because you love them, they're going to start wondering why. So again, it's just to open up that conversation. Acting as an emotional role model. So again, here's where the emotions come in. We're going to try to reframe that I have to be strong for my kids, try to reframe it in a more role model type way. We're modeling how to grieve. We're modeling how we're working through this. It's not something you get over and it's not something you're going to try to hide, but rather we have all these emotions. How can I express them healthy? How can I work through it? How can I cope with it, but in a very healthy way? Because again, they're looking to us to know, how do I deal with these novel emotions? This is a big experience that I've never had to do before. And so they're looking to us to help them regulate, but also having that idea that emotions are okay no matter whether they're good or bad. Emotions are okay. It's what we do with them that's not always okay. So again, thinking about how are you coping? Alcohol and drugs is not very healthy, but really talking about how you're feeling. I'm crying today because I really miss my mom and I'm going to miss seeing her every Saturday or whatever that looks like. But really how we demonstrate, react, and the way we talk about it really helps with how children express it and learn about emotions too. Again, I'm sorry I have to go fast, but going through it. So this is one of my favorite Mr. Rogers quotes. He says, people have said don't cry to each other for years and years, and all it's ever meant is I'm too uncomfortable when you show your feelings. Don't cry. I'd rather have them say, go ahead and cry. I'm here to be with you. I think that's very important, especially when kids are having those big emotions or when you yourself are having those emotions. Because again, if you yourself are grieving, if that was an immediate loss to you, it's going to be really hard to be attentive to the emotions of the children too. So taking time to label your own emotions, make that connection for the children, but also try to check in with them. Like, hey, I noticed that you're really quiet today when you saw me crying. I'm just really sad because I miss whoever it is that you're grieving. But understand how they're feeling and responding accordingly. So it's not, if you see them crying, just like, you're okay, it's fine. But rather, I'm having a moment, I'm having a hard day. It looks like you might be having a hard day too. Let's see if we can go read a book together or go for a walk or anything like that. How can we be responsive to what they're feeling by making them feel okay for having those feelings? So using a variety of those words really helps connect the emotion to that word and help them work through it. Emotional literacy is one of the ways that we work through that. Again, the role model and being attentive and responsive. they're learning about these emotions. These are new feelings that they've never felt. And I know that for me as an adult, there are some days where I don't know how I'm feeling. I don't know how to explain it. So if myself as an adult, I don't know how to explain it, how are we expecting children to explain it? So again, we're introducing all these feelings, and the feelings wheel does correspond with the Inside Out characters. So if you watch that movie with them, you can start talking about emotions in that way too. But just as a visual to show that there are many emotions, contradicting emotions, mixed emotions, and that it all comes together to humanize us. Without these emotions, we're not who we are. So if you numb one, you're numbing them all. So you want to really embrace those emotions, but rather find a positive outlet for it or an okay outlet. Okay, so a child who is old enough to love is old enough to grieve. I think that's a super big take home for this moment, because they need to know that they are loved. They need to know that the person who died loved them and that they had nothing to do with that death. We need to really help them feel loved and secure, because their world is turned upside down, especially if it's a primary caregiver. So really creating that consistency with them, that I am here with you now, I love you, and there's nothing that's going to change that. I'm going to keep you safe. I'm going to love you. And just reassuring them again that they had nothing to do with that death. That's not, if you ate your vegetables, they would still be here, but rather, they loved you and they will love you. But right now we're here. So teachable moments. Plants are a great teachable moment to introduce life and death to a child. Pets are great too. Like Amanda said, it's everywhere. It's on TV. It's in things that we see on the news, movies, anything like that, but really talking about it when it's happening. So if you see a dead bug on the ground, go ahead and talk about the dead bug. If the fish dies, talk about the fish too. But these are all non-threatening deaths that you can kind of embrace and talk about with your child to open up that conversation. Again, the dog isn't being in and out. So that's a teachable moment, but talking not just about when things die, but again, talk about what it means to be alive, give them those concrete biological examples that Amanda had spoken about earlier. So again, children need that pretend play. That's how they're working through all those traumatic or stressful events. They don't always have the words, and they're going to play through it. They might mimic seeing mom cry, or they might announce that the baby has COVID. You don't know. So it's really observing what they're playing and how they're playing. And if there's any misunderstanding with it, how can you correct it? Because if they say, Dolly died, but Dolly's alive again. Okay, well, let's talk about that, and kind of opening it up to that. What does that mean to be dead? And opening up that play with them. Facilitating wonder. Again, they are naturally curious about this. This is a new experience. This dead bug is something like they've never seen before, or this fish, anything like that. So really embracing it when they ask those questions, when they ask why, they're going to ask why or how come. When they ask so many times, they're trying to make sure that that story is consistent and that it's not changing, because they don't want to unlearn it. They're trying to make sense of it. And it's okay for an adult to say, I don't know, or I don't know. Why do you think? Let's find out together. And just embracing that to create that open conversation instead of shutting it down and just say like, oh, just because. So again, we're facilitating that wonder. Thinking about the family and culture is huge, because not all families grieve the same. No two families, even within a family, they can all grieve differently. So thinking about where they are as a family and meeting them there. So it might just be like, hey, I heard that you guys had the death in your family. How are you doing? Checking in with that. But don't assume just because they're religious that they believe in heaven or something like that. So if you're offering resources as an educator or as a family member, thinking about where that family is and asking them, oh, can you tell me more about that? I might have something to help you along with that conversation with your child. When you're ready, maybe we could talk, and just opening it up to them, but understanding that no two families grieve the same or mourn the same. Including children in the process always comes up. I like to say, leave it up to the child. Asking them, would you like to go to a funeral is great. But first, introduce the idea of a funeral. Maybe it's in a book, or maybe you can describe it in detail if they're older. But then asking them, would you like to attend? And if they say yes, that's great. But maybe have a backup person there who can either step outside with them, or maybe if you're comfortable stepping out with them too. But either way, asking them how they would like to participate and opening that up. And if and when you have to bring them to a hospital, COVID, But if you have to bring them to a hospital to say goodbye to, kind of preparing them for what that would look like. There's going to be a lot of machines. There's going to be a lot of beeping. You can hold their hand, but they're not going to say anything back. But at a funeral, there might be a lot of crying or there might be a lot of singing, but just preparing them what that looks like for you. Because again, no two families have the same kind of funeral or the same rituals, but really leaving it up to the child and their comfort level. Maybe they want to draw a picture and put that in the casket. But it's not going to cause them more anxiety. It's going to actually answer a lot of questions that they might have. Because again, this is brand new to them. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she said that the children they're often the forgotten ones, not so much that nobody cares, because we do care. The opposite is true, but few people feel comfortable talking to a child about death. Young children have different concepts of death, and they have to be taken into consideration in order to talk to them and to understand their communications. So again, we love our kids. We're trying to protect them, but they just need it broken down a little bit to get them from that initial understanding, like Amanda said, to that full understanding of death. They just need that scaffold and that discussion. We have a whole bunch of helpful links that we're going to share with you guys, but Sesame Street and Communities is my go-to right now. They have one on grief and they even have one on COVID. I love that site, so I highly recommend that one. And you can screenshot this picture if you guys want to, but these are just some books that we gathered that either talk about emotions or they talk about death of a pet, death of a loved one. There's one about heaven. So it's a little mix up of everything, but I feel like it's a pretty good starting point for a book list for kiddos. And here is our information. Thank you guys for having us. And there's that.
Teresa and Amanda, thank you so much for all that you shared with us today. We do have a number of questions that came both prior to the talk as well as during the talk. So I'll just go through them. There's a lot. I've tried to kind of take out the ones that you've already addressed with your comments, but others have emerged. So we'll go through, but thank you so much for everything that you presented. That was really, really thoughtful and informative. There were a couple of questions that kind of revolved around early childhood educators. And so I'm just going to kind of group them together. One of the questions asks, can you give some examples about how a school staff member would approach or respond to a child informing them that they lost a family member? And then related to that, as an early childhood educator, how do we talk to children without upsetting parents and their own kind of beliefs and preferences about the topic? So kind of two in the same area there.
Do you want to go, Teresa?
Okay. I think it's important to, especially if it's a death within the classroom, like if you're announcing that there's like a pet that died or however you're addressing it in the classroom, maybe sending a note home to parents before explaining the importance of having that conversation and the words that you plan on using within the classroom context. But if they're telling you that, they lost a family member, again, how are you as a family addressing it first? Because we really want to meet them where they are. And if they're saying, we're not talking about it, it's very hush hush, then that's going to be another conversation. Because again, we might notice some behavioral things come up and just saying, we noticed so-and-so is having a harder time. Let's talk about how we can kind of fill in these blanks, how we can kind of support their understanding of what happened and running it together first before approaching it with the child. I don't know if that, anything else to add?
I would add on too, in terms of, I think we actually sometimes take the opposite strategy of what we should. So, in thinking about, worrying about whether families are going to be upset if you bring something up, I think what we often do, because we are worried that we're going to upset a family, we try to not talk about it at all. And that kind of goes back to that category of, the child already knows that this has happened. So I think it's important to approach families and find out, what they would like you to say and what their comfort level is, rather than just ignoring it. Because I think then you've got a child who's just sort of winging it out there, right? And maybe it is something they want to talk about and they're waiting for you to bring it up. They're waiting for you as the adult to demonstrate that there's a supportive environment to ask questions and to work through this in a place that they find comforting. So I think it's actually kind of the opposite, right? It's extremely important for us sometimes to be the ones who reach out to families and say, you know, I'd really would like to talk about this, but let me get your 2 cents first before I do anything, so that we're not leaving the child just kind of hanging. And I would say this definitely for older children as well, not just young children, because, you know, I think oftentimes when kids have experienced major loss and then they head back off to school and everybody tries to pretend that nothing happened, including teachers, and that makes the kid feel weird, right? Because then they feel like they're already feeling like something unusual happened to them, that they had an experience that's not the norm. And then we make it really seem like not the norm by, you know, having everything be hush hush. So
That's really helpful. That's really helpful. Thank you. There was another question. It was a little more general about talking to children around death. And the question asked, you know, how do you answer sort of general questions that your children might ask about death, like when they might die, or how old people are when they die, or what will happen if you die? Are there thoughts you could share about that?
Go ahead, Teresa. I'll just tag on. Teresa knows everything.
No, by no means am I an expert. I just really like the topic. I think that's really tricky, you know, because there's no way of knowing, which is kind of the scary part, right? Is that we don't know when we're going to die or what that's going to look like. But keeping the focus on, you know, where we are right now is that, you know, typically we die when we're really, really, really old, and we're not really, really old right now, and having that conversation, but at the same time, really just focusing on right now, you know, we're healthy and we're safe, and I'm going to love you here. And even when I die, I'm going to love you. And if I'm not here to take care of you, have that person in mind, you know, so-and-so is going to help take care of you, and, you know, carrying on those traditions too. But just because somebody leaves doesn't mean that the love dies too, you know, just because they died, that love is still there. So I think that's a big emphasis too, but it's just hard because we don't have a concrete answer. And so I don't know. What do you think?
And are those pretty typical questions of younger children? In other words, just wondering about death and asking those types of questions?
I would say so, yeah. But I mean, even if you ask them, well, I don't know, when do you think we're going to die? Oh, when we're 105, you know, you don't know. They have their own ideas too, but.
I can kind of chime in here. So my husband passed away 5 years ago. And so my children, obviously, this has been part of their lives. But actually, the question is not really related to their personal experience or the answer. But my daughter nannies. She's in child development as well, and she nannies. And somehow or other, this topic always comes up for every group of children that she nannies for or works with. And they are absolutely fascinated and constantly ask for questions about her dad dying and when did her dad die and how did her dad die. And so she has gotten really good about talking with young children about death, and they'll kind of wrap back around. So they'll have a question, and then you can tell that they kind of go mull it over, maybe get to a new phase developmentally. Children do the same thing with other parts of biology, right? This is why it's naive. And then as you run into new experiences, I always laugh when my daughter asked a lot of questions about how babies get out. And then about the time that I was pregnant with my son, I could tell she was ready for how the babies get in. And, you know, obviously now this is happening in her life. So we had a lot of questions about how babies get in during that time phase. But yes, they ask a lot of questions, and they're very, very curious about this topic. So yeah, I think we just answer as honestly as we can for where they're at developmentally.
That was very helpful. Thank you. There are some other questions about children and their responses, but a little bit more talking about sort of tragedy and the fear around that. So one of the questions that was asked was, how do we talk to our children about tragic deaths in a way that doesn't make children worried that it will happen to them? And there was another question, very specific, because it was talking about how do you talk to a child who has had a family member who died from COVID, but that child has also tested positive for COVID. So, I think, kind of similar in that vein of how children kind of internalize their own fears about death based on their experiences with death and loss. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think kind of alluded to it already, right? That you really emphasize what particular characteristics maybe of why that particular person died. So, unfortunately, even with COVID, we know that, there are deaths among people who are younger and people who are seemingly healthy, but that's not the majority of people who die by COVID, right? So I think it really is important to be honest about talking about death, but also to use data to our advantage, right? And so, I think we can still present some pretty good evidence and data that even with COVID, it tends to be people who, it's kind of like the flu too, right? That if you have underlying conditions or if you're older, the flu is more dangerous for you. That the COVID doesn't seem to be particularly dangerous for young children. It really is more like just having a cold or the flu. And so I think, using factual information when we can, and when factual information isn't on our side, then maybe downplaying the facts just a little bit so it's not scary, right? So, if we think about like drowning, we know that drowning does happen a lot more to small children. And so that's why you talk about safety measures that you have in place, right? So, I think with COVID, that's a good reason why, this is why we wear our masks when we go places, because our masks help to keep us safe. And this is why we don't shake hands right now, right? We hold up an elbow, or we do a far away high five or blow kisses from far away. So.
And that's what I was going to say, very concrete ways of keeping them safe. Like, yes, that is true that, other people are dying too, but we're going to stay healthy by washing hands. And even if you test positive, it might be that, our bodies are telling us that we need to rest for a little while, and that's okay to rest and be careful at home and keep others healthy too, because we don't want to spread our germs, and just explaining it in that manner.
This is why we wanted to do this talk right now with COVID, because if death wasn't all around us before, unfortunately, this is kind of an unavoidable topic, I think, for many families right now. So,
no, it's so important to talk about, especially now. In that vein, another tough question: how do you talk to children about the death of a parent or parents?
So their primary caregiver, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
It's the same throughout all the information that we had given, that the parent died, kind of talking to them about what changes that might mean within the household too. If that parent drove them to school every day, that's going to be a big change. But still including them in, I'm here and I love you. And I know that whoever had died still loves you. They can't be here, but we can talk about them. And, I might get sad when we talk about them, but that's okay. It just means that I love them a lot. But when I feel sad, I'm going to give you a big hug and, or look at pictures or talk about them in those happy times that we had, but still talking about that person in that positive regard and not so much like a scary regard, but still using, again, those dead and died terms are huge, and what that means to them, however they died, if they died of a heart attack or if they died of natural causes, if you say they died in their sleep, that can be a little scary. So you can talk about what actually happened with their body. But yeah, I think it's just talking about what those differences might look like, especially at home.
Well, and to tag on also, I think that Teresa mentioning earlier, I do think it's really important to include children in the process, right? So, because obviously there will be services and things that happen that are, family events. So what is children's comfort level with those things, right? So just because it was your parent doesn't mean you're obligated to do anything, right? You're not obligated to do anything outside of your comfort zone. And so, depending on children's age, asking them as honestly as you can, informing them what those things mean, and whether they want to participate. I think it's also really important to, do that sharing of positive memories, right? So as soon as you feel able, if you are a surviving family member who is now caring for children, to think about how you can share positive stories and start having some, maybe modified or new traditions, right? So, thinking about ways that you can honor that person, because you don't want them to feel like, people move forward, they don't move on, right? So if you never talk about it, if you never bring that person up, if you never tell stories, if you don't have any memories, then that child might feel like that's a taboo topic, right? That it's so upsetting to you that they can't bring it up. So you kind of have to figure out a way to work on your own stuff a little bit so that you can, because unfortunately, especially if you're a surviving partner, you're still responsible for children and their health and well-being. So that's difficult. So therapy for yourself and everybody else.
Definitely.
But I could see that's such a good point, because as adults, we're more likely to have outlets, right? Where we can talk to and express our grief and get support. But children may not be maybe less likely to have those. And so if they're getting a message from us as adults that it's not okay to talk about, it's not okay to express, they really aren't going to find that support in other places.
Right. And I think that's why I think it's important to because, they see that when you ask for example, where's Papa? And you cry every time they ask, and you're not telling them what's happening in your mind, and they're learning oh, this makes her sad, I'm not even going to talk about it, I can't ask it, kind of thing. But rather, when you ask me where Papa was, that made me really sad because I miss him so much. But it's okay for us to talk about him. I'm going to cry a little bit, and just letting them know that's okay, that's expected, and that it's not them that's making you sad, but rather, those memories, and just the fact that they're not here anymore, but never making them feel like they're the one causing it.
Well, and I was going to tag on too and say, I think for older children, we have this mistaken assumption that because they're so peer oriented, that they're going to talk with their peers about this particular topic. And, my son was 14 when he lost his dad. And I can tell you that would be the last thing he would do with his friends. Because it was uncomfortable and it wasn't something that his friends had experienced. They all had all parents still alive. So it made him feel weird. It made him feel awkward. It made him feel isolated. So, if you're not talking about it at home, then, your older child may not have anybody to talk to it about, especially if schools are ignoring it. And that's kind of what I was alluding to before, is I think a lot of times teachers and schools do know, but they don't say anything and they don't provide any kind of support. And then they go, oh, your kid's doing fine, they have good grades. So, I think we just need to be really sensitive and make sure that the child has at least one outlet, one way to talk about things. So.
Now, would you recommend encouraging children, and maybe there's an age range on this where the answer is different, but would you encourage children to reach out to their peers, to reach out to their friends, to talk about death or the experience of death they may have had?
I think it definitely depends on the age of the child, because I was helping at a preschool, and one of the girls, she looked to her friends and she's like, my uncle died in Nigeria, we're going to go visit him. I'm like, okay. So it wasn't that there was a need for encouragement at all. She just went out. But especially for the older ones, if they can find that group of peers that they feel comfortable talking about, if they don't want to talk about it with you, hopefully they have that support. But I think, like Amanda said, especially in the teens, they don't want to feel even more isolated and different than their peers and anything else. I think it just depends on the age of the child.
And this is where I think we need a system change too, right? So, we've talked a lot about diversity this year, and, talking more openly about issues like racism and diversity. And I think this kind of falls in that same camp, right? Things that we thought young children were too young to talk about, things that we avoided that we shouldn't be avoiding, right? So the more you talk about things when kids are little, the more comfortable they are talking about those things when they get big. So I think that's where we really need to have kind of that sea change, right? So if we do a better job with this in early childhood, if we realize that this is a topic young children are interested in, and we give them the language, right? We give them the language and the ability and that recognition that peers and adults will support them in discussing these topics, then hopefully down the line developmentally later, it's something that they're more comfortable talking about because they've been talking about it ever since they were little. So right. I think
that makes a lot of sense.
We could do a lot in changing that over time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We had a couple questions that came up on the same topic during the talk, because you mentioned, each of you kind of mentioned at times, thoughtfully using the right words, right? Using the word dead, using the word died, and sort of, communicating in those real terms. But a couple folks asked questions about that. One was, do we need to be cautious then about referring to other things as dead, like my cell phone is dead? Does that cause confusion? And then someone else asked, kind of related, for the adult themselves, how do we not feel, harsh or cold by using words that, we ourselves maybe, feel that these are harsh, cold words?
I think it's definitely tricky because, your battery dies all the time, you're talking about that. And so I think understanding that, maybe just, my phone is low on power, just saying that, instead of that dead and died. But the more that we use it in that, again, that biological sense that Amanda was talking about, they're curious about it already. If you're talking about plants dying or, the pets dying, anything like that, using those smaller, more teachable moments to talk about death. And this is like dead, it can't come back. There's no growing back. Whereas, the cell phone, you can talk about just like losing power. But I think now that you've heard it and you're going to be a little more aware of how often it's used in a separate context than somebody dying, I think it's going to kind of like shatter that glass kind of a thing. And you're just going to be more aware of it and use it in the I don't want to say correct terms, but in a sense of something dying. And then the second part, I can't remember the second part. Sorry, that was the big one.
About helping us as adults kind of not feel like we're being cold or harsh when we use language like
right.
that.
And I think that just comes down to the culture that we're in, very death denying culture. And so we don't like to talk about it. It's very taboo. It makes us uncomfortable. It's not that it's harsh. It's what it is, that all living things will die. Like that is a hard truth about it, but it doesn't have to mean what we think, it doesn't have to be that cold and harsh part, but rather, death is just a part of life, and we are loving the life that we are living right now. We're going to love the life that we have. And when it comes time to say goodbye, we're going to approach that with as much love and understanding as possible too. So I think it's just changing how we think of it as a culture, but also individually, within your own, like Amanda was saying, your own beliefs, like what does that mean to you, and kind of addressing it there as well.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Well, and just, with the language piece, I think especially when you've lost someone in an unexpected way, you listen to words that people use and you realize how often we use words that are incorrect and possibly even offensive to people who have lost someone. Mm-hmm. So, I do think, not to like make you scared every time you open your mouth and use a word. But I do think some reflectivity on words that we use and the context that we use them in is important, right? Because we do want to be accurate in our language, and the accurate words are dead and died, but we want to use them in accurate ways. We want to use them for when something has truly died or is dead, not about our cell phones and things like that. So, I think it's just kind of, I like that glass is shattered kind of image, right? That it's just, we need to think about those kinds of things in different ways in the words that we're using. So.
Oh, that's great. That's really helpful. And I think that's an important, the idea of recognizing that this is challenging for adults as well, right? That some of these, in working through how do we talk about these issues with our children, it reveals that there are challenges that we as adults face in trying to talk about death and loss. Yeah. Okay, we have a little bit, just a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap up. One question that came up a couple of times was around death by suicide. And the questions kind of to kind of group them together, I think the general idea is that, are there different conversations? Are there other ways that we should be talking to children about death by suicide than some of the ways that you've talked about already? In other words, is that a unique form of loss and a unique form of death that maybe needs to be treated differently?
Teresa, I know you had a great thing to say when we did our previous presentation on this, so I'll let you start and then I can add in. But I don't know if you remember what you said, but I just remember thinking, oh, that's perfect.
I was going right there. It was from one of our books on the list, When Dinosaurs Die, and it was saying that when a person is so far without hope that they feel no more hope, that they take their own life, and that's called suicide. And it's very simple, very matter of fact. Again, it's sad. It's something that we don't want to talk about. It's a very taboo subject, but it does happen, and so it's just another way of explaining it in a developmentally appropriate term. So that way it is understandable. It's a truth that we don't always want to accept either. But again, being the society that we are, being a little more open about talking about it, because those who lose somebody by suicide often feel isolated too, because, it's a very taboo subject. How do you plan a funeral for somebody who took their own life? Is it still a celebration of life? It can be a very, very difficult conversation to have, even with loved ones. So having that conversation with the child, they just referred to it as a person lost all their hope and they took their own life.
And sharing from a very personal view, because this was the personal loss that we experienced. So I know for my own children, they were 14 and 19 when their dad died. And so we talked a lot about the biology of it, right? Because, our brain is one of our, it's inside our body, right? And unfortunately, when people die by suicide, often there is something awry in that particular, I don't know if it's an organ. Now I'm revealing my lack of biological knowledge, but there's often something awry in the brain, right? So, we talked a lot about, brain not working for a long time. And sometimes your brain makes you very sick. And yes, then it can make you feel very sad and make it hard for you to do the things that you need to do every day. And so then sometimes you want to stop, right? You want to stop your body from working. So that was something that was really helpful in our family, is talking about it in that way, right? That there's lots of ways to be sick and there are lots of ways to die. Actually, a lovely colleague, if you are spiritual at all, said something that really resonated with me at that time. And it was that there is a time when God wants you to come home and he will find any way for you to get there, even if we don't particularly understand that way, right? So if you are religious at all, that might be something that you find comforting and helpful. But yeah, I think you just have to kind of break it down to that biology and talk about things as honestly as you can. This is where I was also reflecting on language, because you realize how many people say things like, oh, I was just so sad I wanted to die, and just kill me, just shoot me. I mean, those things that we say, even committed suicide, as a person who's lost someone to suicide, I find it to be an offensive term. I prefer died by suicide, right? Because the person died and it was by suicide. It's much less stigmatizing. And it is a very complicated kind of grief. And I think, not only did my son lose a parent, but he lost a parent in this complicated kind of way, which made him feel even more isolated and more uncomfortable bringing it up. And then you also, you have all, in addition to regular grief, you've got all that other stuff going on. You feel guilty and, why did they leave? And so, yeah, I think as much as you can bring it back down to biology and help kids understand that it's not about them. It's not the person wanting to leave them. It's the person whose brain isn't quite working the way that it needs to, right? And unfortunately, sometimes our brain tells us things that aren't true. And for so many people who die by suicide, their brain is telling them things that aren't true, right? That they aren't important, or that they're a burden to other people. And so they're trying to make their brain stop telling them those things that are untruthful. So yeah, it definitely is a more complicated one.
Thank you for that. That clearly a more complicated one, and I think you both provided some really thoughtful and helpful guidelines and strategies. We are just about out of time, so I want to. I know we weren't able to get to all of the questions, so my apologies if you asked a question that we did not get to. But I do want to extend sincere thanks to Amanda and Teresa for your really thoughtful guidance, both in the presentation as well as in answering all of these questions. That was quite a lot, and it was really powerful and really important. So thank you for that. But with that, again, my thanks to the presenters and my thanks to all of you for participating in today's webinar hosted by the Institute for Child Development and Family Relations at California State University, San Bernardino. We've been providing guidance for parents and families based on science and best practice since 2002. Have a wonderful day and be well.
Thank you.